news, European austerity continues to take its toll. On Tuesday, Greece issued a warning to all the banksters who've invested in about $260 billion worth of Greek debt, telling them that they'd better take a new deal, accepting about half the value of their investments, or risk getting nothing at all. Greece is hoping that about 90% of its investors will agree to take that haircut, giving Greece a chance to restructure its debt in a way that's more manageable. And investors have until Thursday to decide if they're going to take the deal. If they choose not to, then once again a Greek default becomes a very real possibility. Of course, asking investors to take a haircut is nothing compared to what the Greek people have had to sacrifice under years of austerity, with massive layoffs, huge cuts to social services, and wage cuts, all of which have led to unrest in the streets, hostility with neighboring nations like Germany, and even the ousting of democratically elected leaders. Greece right now is the epicenter of the crisis of corporate capitalism that is engulfing the world today. And the question isn't how things will work out in Greece, but instead, how long until what we're seeing in Greece comes to the United States? Richard Wolff joins me now. He is an economist and visiting professor with the graduate program in international affairs at New School University in New York City. And Dr. Wolff, great to have you with us.
Thank you very much, Tom.
And also the author of the book, Capitalism Hits the Fan. I don't want to forget that. And I believe we popped it up on the screen there. Most Americans look at Greece and think, oh, that's far away. That's got nothing to do with us. You know, why should I care? Why should we care?
We should care because Greece is a little corner of Europe. It's a few million people. It couldn't by any stretch of the imagination be held accountable for the global economic crisis. And yet that crisis is being played out in a way that crushes that entire nation. And let me just give you a few of the basics of it. In the deal that was just struck so that they could get a little more help from Europe, they have to cut the minimum wage by 22%. That takes the poorest people in a poor country and says, this is a global economic system in which you are a tiny corner that didn't cause any problem, but we're really going to whack you, and you're the poorest people. Number two, part of the deal is to cut 150,000 more workers off the payroll of the government. In Greece, there are 800,000 people that work for the government now. It's a little country, and that's a big part of their job scene. You're going to cut 150,000 people from a payroll of 800,000 in a country whose current unemployment rate is 19.9%. This is lunacy. This is a way of crushing a society and making a kind of demonstration case for all Europeans and for Americans. This is an economic crisis, and we're going to solve the crisis on the backs of the poorest, most distressed part of the population. That's how we work in a capitalist system. That's who we victimize. And I think Americans ought to be very, very concerned. Certainly the rest of Europe is. Because this is a model that says we too in the United States are going to be thinking about cutting minimum wage, cutting back Social Security, cutting back, as almost every state and city are doing in our country, on public education, on public safety, and so on. So the Greeks are the advance case being tested, how far you can push a population, so that other countries that are moving in that direction will have a clear idea of what best to do, what not to do. It's a little bit like an experiment, and it should give all of us real pause.
Well, in the United States, we've seen, we have 25 states that are run by basically Democrats that have actually increased taxes, increased spending. And as a result of that, unemployment's gone down, GDP's gone up. There's 24 states that are run by Republicans. There's one that nothing's happened. 24 states run by Republicans where they've laid off government workers, they've cut their government spending, they've cut taxes, and the result is that their GDP has gone down and their unemployment has gone up. So you'd think we could see it here. The UK is doing their austerity thing. Their economy is going in the tank.
That's right.
But austerity is not happening in Germany. It's not happening in France. It's not happening in Sweden, Denmark, Finland, Norway. Those countries are all spending like there's no tomorrow, and their government spending is well over 50% of GDP. They're doing just fine. So how can the world look at this and think that, I mean, why doesn't everybody get this?
Well, I like to give an example. It's a little bit a kind of amnesia for Americans, because the last time this country was in the 1930s, the Great Depression, we had a president who came in and started out being a centrist, balanced budget, all of that.
That's what Roosevelt campaigned on in 32.
Exactly.
Right.
And so, but within a year or two of taking office, as the horrific nature of what was happening to the mass of people became clear to him, and more important, the mass of people found an organized way to express themselves, he completely reversed himself.
Right.
And suddenly, all those things we hear today, there isn't enough money, we have to cut back, that was a worse depression. They had a bigger problem of not having money, but the reality was Roosevelt created Social Security where there hadn't been one. He created the unemployment insurance program. He gave old people a lot of money for the rest of their lives, and he gave unemployed people a lot of money. And then the capstone, he hired 12 million people in the next 4 or 5 years.
Government became an employer of last resort.
Suddenly, the government was going to do what we might call trickle-up economics.
Right.
Give them at the bottom, let them have the money to spend, to keep their homes, and to take care of their families, and that'll make money for corporations. And when everybody wondered, where did you get the money? The answer was clear. He taxed corporations and he taxed the rich at higher rates than they've ever paid since. Right. And he found the money, and that changed the dynamic. Didn't solve the Great Depression, but it made the burden of it much less for the mass of people and helped change the whole direction that got us out. Well, so it isn't even just measuring today. It's our own history ought to teach us that this is not, austerity and Greece is not the way to go.
And those people who say, well, government spending didn't get us out of the Great Depression, World War II did, my response is, well, wasn't that a huge government spending program? It was,
and it was the extension of what had been done before around Social Security. That's right.
Yeah, and then followed. Describe the situation in Greece. You were talking about the we or they. There was a pronoun in there of the group that is testing, you know, how far can we push Greece? Let's take this weak, enfeebled, poor, small country and slam them up against the wall and see how far we can push them. Who's that group that's doing that? Is that, I mean, you know, Greece is now being run by a guy who used to be a banker, and he was never elected. He was put into office when the guy who was elected said, hey, let's have a national referendum on whether to come out of office that week. You know,
the they?
Who is the they?
Real simple. It's the president of France, who's probably not going to be president very much longer, Mr. Sarkozy. It is the chancellor in Germany, Mrs. Merkel. It is the bankers of Greece, who have a lot at stake because they're the biggest lenders to the Greek government. They want a settlement that takes care of them. They're willing to forego some of the debt, but they want to get, in exchange for the bonds they're giving up, another set of bonds, which is what this deal is, which will emburden the country of Greece for years to come with servicing that debt, paying the interest, paying that back, because they're not going to be allowed to do this again. So it's people who want to solve the problem of this great economic crisis on the backs of those people.
But that sounds a lot like the dynamic tensions that existed in the 19-teens in Europe when Archduke Ferdinand was assassinated in Sarajevo. I mean, is this the kind of thing that could literally trip off a intra-European war?
Absolutely, and you can see already from the footage that you've shown your viewers that the tensions in Greece, no one has ever seen this before. This is going back to the end of World War II, when Greece was right between, you know, the eastern part of Europe and the western part, and there were all those struggles. The Greeks are beside themselves. I mean, I have students of mine who are professors in Greek universities. They've had their wages cut as a teacher, because all universities are public there, 43% since May of 2010. They can't function as human beings. They can't take care of their families. They can't maintain their homes. You're driving people who really had nothing to do with this crisis, weren't part of the banking system, didn't negotiate the loans, didn't demand any of this. You're now saying you're going to have to pay.
So in the 2 minutes or so we have left, who did precipitate this crisis? Who created this crisis? And what's your suggestion of how Greece should get out of it and we should avoid?
Many people participated in producing this crisis. I'm not going to say it's this one or that one. It's a system that doesn't work. And I don't want to blame the bankers either. They're caught up in this. They're caught up in a system that makes it reasonable to do things, for example, to give loans to Greece year after year, even when the conditions are very questionable, when they'll hustle that Goldman Sachs and others did, is very well known in the banking community. They made loans. You know, the job of a banker is to be a prudent lender. They weren't real prudent, to say the least. And they hustled with their fellow bankers and made a country, put a country in hock to deal with the results of what they did wrong. And we're now seeing that that is being taken to the extent of really breaking down a whole country. And I think there's going to be a blowback and a pushback from that that is going to take scary shape in Europe and beyond, because so many countries are doing it.
How do we avoid that coming to America?
I think we have to face the fact that austerity is morally, ethically, and economically unacceptable, and that we have to change the direction of the United States so it isn't half the states one way or the other, but there's a radical remembrance of what we did in the Great Depression, and we bring it back as a key part of what has to be done here.
And what would you then you would say to the Republicans who are saying cut Social Security, cut Medicare, cut all, stop.
Stop what you're doing. Realize that the way to go is corporations who pay lower taxes now than at any time in the last half century. Wealthy people who pay lower taxes, income taxes, than at any time in the last half century.
And both are doing better than they have.
And they're better than ever before. They helped bring this crisis. You know, in the 1950s and 60s, when we had 91% top bracket on our income tax, the rationale, and we taxed corporations, was we're coming out of a world war. We have to get out, and the people who have the most should give the most. That's the logic we should use today. Then the money would be there to stimulate the economy, and no debt that we would have to borrow because we taxed it from the people we're now borrowing it from, and that's a mistake.
We have it ourselves. We can do it. Richard Wolff, thanks so much for being with us.
Good to talk to you.
It's great to see you in the studio.